still stuck in the fine material realm, or are there any benefits to the fine material realm versus the human realm? Sometimes I don't know the answer to these questions. If the jhana practitioner for years were to see the light and swear off, you mean to give up the practice of dry vipassana meditation? When it says to swear off, oh, I see. If the practitioner, and swear off to practice dry vipassana with concentration at the level of access, is he or she still stuck in the fine material realm? Or are there any benefits to fine material versus human? I really don't know. Maybe we just put this aside. It's is it possible that the condition number 14, the karma result condition, is what applies to rebirth linking? Of course, it also applies to rebirth linking, because the rebirth linking consciousness is a resultant consciousness. So, between the citta and the mental factors, the ceitasikas, on the occasion of rebirth linking consciousness, all of those mental factors are related to each other as resultant conditions. And I think they're also related to the materiality that arises at the occasion, on the occasion of rebirth linking, the material form component also related to that as result condition, I believe. Let me just check. Result. Okay, result condition. The condition states the other resultant citta and ceitasikas and the co-nascent material phenomena. Yeah, so at rebirth, the event of rebirth linking, the result condition obtains between the citta and the mental factors, all in relation to each other, and all of them in relation to the material form existing at the moment of rebirth linking. What? Okay. Okay. So the person who's writing says, I like to ground my practice in phenomena I can observe and therefore confirmed directly or that have been demonstrated by science. So there are two things that the teachings seem to ask us to take on faith. One is rebirth, and the other is the non-continuity of consciousness, that is, cittas that are discrete. Can you offer any ways to increase my confidence? Oh, he says, if you address my question at the 7 o'clock session, I will be at home and watching through the web. So, okay, I did deal with this question. Somebody raised the same problem about rebirth last evening, if I remember. And then somebody asked what to do if they can't take the doctrine of rebirth on faith. And what I said is, don't restrict your practice of Buddhism to a belief in rebirth and karma operating across lives. These are teachings of the Buddha, which we find delivered repeatedly throughout the Sutta Pitaka. So I take them, I think that there's fairly good evidence. If anything comes from the Buddha himself, these teachings do come from the Buddha. So since I have that trust in the Buddha, I accept them myself out of faith. But what I would say is that if one has trouble with these teachings, don't give up the practice of Buddhism, but just put these teachings sort of in brackets for the time being, put them aside, and devote oneself to the kind of practices that you can see are directly and visibly beneficial to yourself. So that's with regard to the teaching of rebirth. But just don't reject it and say that it's not true, not valid, can't be accepted. In the note, he says that he read one of these books on the case studies of rebirth, but he says the evidence given there is intriguing but anecdotal. Actually, I think the works of Dr. Ian Stevenson are much more than anecdotal. They've been investigated very rigorously. And Dr. Stevenson, he doesn't come to the conclusion that these cases prove rebirth. But what he says, he offers various explanations of these children who can, as soon as they're able to speak, they report that they tell their parents, you're not my only parents, but I have some other parents living. They'll mention the name of a village or town several miles away. They'll describe it in detail, the names of their parents, the names of the brother and sister, what the house looked like, who they were in that past life and how they died. And Stevenson has investigated a lot of these cases and recorded them in his books. It's much more rigorous than somebody saying, oh, I remember being a princess in Egypt during the time of the pharaohs. And they're quite rigorously examined cases. And Stevenson offers various explanations for these children being able to remember of these events that they ascribe to a past life. And then the conclusion that he usually comes to is that amongst all the explanations that can be offered, the hypothesis of a reincarnation having taken place is the simplest and most convincing. Otherwise, how do you explain that the child who's never been to that village 20 miles away doesn't have any relatives there? How do they remember? How do they gather all of that information? And then there's a book by my friend Bhikkhu Analayo called, is it Rebirth? Buddhism and Rebirth. I don't remember the exact title, but he summarizes in a couple of the chapters the results of the investigation of Dr. Ian Stevenson and another researcher named Jim Tucker, who's followed the work of the late Ian Stevenson. Okay, so But I'm saying if you don't find all of this evidence convincing, it doesn't mean that you should give up on the Buddha's teaching, but continue to practice and discover whatever benefits you could obtain from the practice that are directly experiential here and now. As for the discreteness of the citta, I wouldn't make a big deal out of this. But what does happen, and I found this myself, especially when one is doing long-term intensive meditation over a long period of time, where the mindfulness and the discernment, the power of discernment become sharper and sharper, one starts to see, I can't say myself that I see it at the citta by citta level, but one starts to see how one state of consciousness, even if it's an extended experience in time, how it just arises, lasts for a brief moment, stops, and then there's another moment and another and another. So that seems to give, at a coarser level, some kind of experiential insight into the discreteness of the process of consciousness. And I hear from meditators who are much more successful than myself, they say that when you really get powerful samadhi and then use that to contemplate the stream of consciousness, you can actually see the cittas at the momentary level. These are the meditators who follow the Burmese master Pa Auk Soyador, who uses the fourth jhana as a basis for developing insight. And so at that point you have extremely powerful samadhi as a tool for contemplation. Okay, next. It's almost the same thing. Okay. Bhante, do you know if cognitive science has confirmed that consciousness is actually a sequence of cittas and not continuous? Did you ever have a chance to compare notes between the Buddhist texts and cognitive science? I haven't done that investigation myself. I don't know actually what cognitive science says about the process of consciousness. Certainly, objective cognitive science wouldn't come up and discover that there's a series of cittas. So they would say that, that's a greed rooted, a citta rooted in greed. That's the investigating citta accompanied the unwholesome resultant, investigating consciousness accompanied by equanimity. If cognitive science ever came up with those discoveries, it would be mind-blowing for me. But perhaps there are cognitive scientists who have been investigating the way the mind works and discover that consciousness is actually a series of discrete acts of cognition rather than a continuous flow. Okay, what is the best definition of delusion? Can you please give the example of a deluded mind? No, it's not a funny question. It's a serious question. So actually, the English word delusion is a little bit misleading or too strong. The Pali word is moha. The noun is moha, which is based on the verb moihati, which is like to be cloudy-minded or to be confused. So it's something of a state of confusion. Whereas delusion, you usually think of somebody who has delusions of grandeur, somebody who thinks, I'm Napoleon, or I'm Jesus Christ, or I'm the Buddha. But delusion, the way it's explained classically, it is equated with ignorance. And in Buddhist sort of theory of liberation, delusion is explained as not knowing the Four Noble Truths. not knowing suffering, its origin, cessation, and the path. But I would also say that delusion is, maybe it has more, or moha has more basic applications. Not, I would say, like not knowing the distinction between good and bad, between the wholesome and the unwholesome, would also be included under delusion. And then, of course, we would say underlying any kind of greed, any kind of hatred, there is delusion. So this doesn't seem to work. Not knowing the Four Noble Truths doesn't seem to work in that context. So delusion would be a sort of maybe misinterpretation of a situation, so that one thinks that, in the case of greed, obtaining the objects of desire is going to extinguish my desire and completely satisfy me. So that kind of underlying premise or assumption would be a manifestation of delusion. In the case of the aversion or hatred consciousness, maybe it's the delusion which makes one conceptualize the other person as a truly existing individual who is antagonistic and obstructive to oneself. And so, in that case, hatred arises. And then in the Abhidhamma system, the two states of consciousness in which delusion is prominent, one is the doubting consciousness, where one can't make up one's mind, is the Buddha fully enlightened or not? Is the Dharma that he teaches valid, true or not? So that's the doubting consciousness. And the other deluded consciousness is the one that is overrun by restlessness and agitation. Same handwriting. Okay, can the arising and passing away of individual consciousness be seen during meditation, in which, maybe that's jhana, it looks like jhana. Okay, so in a way I almost dealt with this question just a few moments ago. Okay, so if the question means, can the individual cittas be seen, the arising and passing away of the individual momentary cittas be seen during meditation, maybe for most meditators that can't be seen. But as I said, Pa Auk Soyador and those who utilize his method say that they see the arising and passing away even of the individual cittas in a single series of cittas. And they do this based on the fourth jhana. But if one doesn't obtain the jhanas, even by doing intensive long-term insight meditation, you might not see the arising and passing away of individual discrete cittas, but you see how experience arises and passes away very, very quickly, so that it seems that one is applying to one's experience a microscope with different levels of magnification. So at one level of concentration, one is seeing it maybe at 100 times magnification. As the concentration gets stronger, it's like 200 times magnification. As the concentration gets still stronger, it seems that you're seeing it 300 times magnification. Like going from the cellular level to the molecular level, to the cellular level, to the molecular level, to the atomic level of the flow of consciousness. Actually, all three of these questions are in the same handwriting. Okay, would you explain how to use dependent origination as a daily practice to overcome addiction and craving. Okay, first I would say if there's a strong addiction, like addiction to the use of liquor, drug addiction, or even maybe somebody who's strongly addicted to the use of cigarettes, I don't think Buddha's practice on its own will be a sufficient remedy for that. For that, I think one might have to undergo some, professional consultation. But let's say it's mild addictions, not these obsessive addictions. So one doesn't use dependent origination to overcome that itself, but dependent origination in the sutta version will show you how these addictions occur. Let me see if I could get the file. Okay, so here we could see, okay, we could start with the 6 sense bases. With the 6 sense bases as condition, there is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. With feeling as condition, there is craving. With craving as condition, there is clinging. Let me increase this. Oh, it's not. It doesn't matter. I'm just reading it. It's enough. You don't need it on the screen. Okay, so we could say that clinging corresponds to the addiction. Because when you're addicted to something, you can't let it go. You have to keep on using it. So that is like clinging. And one understands that the clinging arises from craving, and the craving arises from feeling. So let's say somebody is a cigarette smoker, and so whenever they smoke the cigarette, somehow they consider it to be an enjoyable experience, and so it gives rise to a kind of pleasant feeling. And so when they stop the cigarette, they put out the cigarette, and then maybe an hour later, 2 hours later, there comes a recollection of the pleasant feelings that arose in connection with the cigarette. Then the craving arises, and then through that craving, there comes the clinging that I have to light up a cigarette to get that pleasant feeling. And so in a way, this is creating new existence, the existence of oneself as a cigarette addict. So what one would do, at least to help break the addiction, when one contemplates danger in things that can be clung to, craving ceases, then with the cessation of craving comes cessation of clinging. Okay, so if one wants to break that addiction, one of the things that's useful is to reflect on the danger in that addiction, in the use of those substances that cause the addiction. So in the case of the cigarette smoking, one could reflect on the dangers. You just have to look at the pack of the cigarettes to get some idea of the dangers. Though I don't know whether the cigarette industry, does it still have so much influence that it fudges up the information on the packet? Now it's very frank and clear. I remember back in the 1990s when I visited my parents. At that time, my mother was a smoker, and she had the pack of cigarettes. I looked at the warning on the cigarettes, and it was so obscure that I said to my father, how are they printing this? And he said, this is the influence of the tobacco industry, that they fudge the warning so that you can't make head or tail out of it. Okay, but if you reflect on the danger, lung cancer, heart disease, strokes, and then really consider, do I want to risk those? That could be a deterrent to help you stop smoking. And then you could apply to the dependent origination some of the practices of especially the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So when the craving arises, one just becomes mindful. There is craving in the mind for a cigarette. And then one observes that craving and just lets the craving go its own way without acting on the craving. And that can help to break the addiction. So those are some examples of how to use dependent origination, and especially the 4 foundations of mindfulness can help to weaken and maybe break the addiction. But as I said, if it's a very long-term, serious, strong addiction, one might really need outside help. Don't try completely to depend on yourself using the Buddhist meditative techniques. They're not a sure guarantee. I think I'm getting the questions mixed up. Okay, the same handwriting. Okay, can you please give us a historical perspective on the suttas, the Visuddhimagga, and the Abhidhamma? When were they written? Who wrote them? And some background of who wrote them. Okay, the oldest stratum among these groups of literature is the Sutta Pitaka. So these are the texts, especially these suttas that come out of the 4 main Nikayas. These are the supposed to be the recordings, let's say the recorded versions of the discourses of the Buddha, at least as they were compiled at the early Buddhist councils by the monks who participated in the early Buddhist councils. To what extent the discourses that were established at those councils, to what extent they represent the words of the Buddha verbatim, that we can't know for sure. I suspect just from the form of the suttas that they've undergone a lot of editing and maybe simplification to make them suitable for the process of oral transmission. A lot of standardization and formulaic ways of representing the teaching to make it easy to transmit orally. So the oldest layer is the suttas. Then comes the Abhidharma, which according to the Theravada tradition, they say that the Buddha taught the Abhidhamma himself in one of the heavenly realms, and then he gave the methods to Sariputta, and Sariputta then elaborated on the methods given by the Buddha and composed the books of the Abhidhamma. This is a nice legend, but it's probably not substantiated. It cannot be substantiated by historical scholarship. According to most historical scholars, the Abhidhamma is the product of a period of development and evolution, which might have taken place over 2 or 3 centuries, till probably the final books of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, as we have them now, perhaps finalized about 200, 300 years after the passing of the Buddha. And we could see this, understand this, because there are different schools of early Buddhism, and several of them also had Abhidhammas, which are quite different from the Theravada Abhidhamma. So obviously the Theravada Abhidhamma is one version of the Abhidhamma preserved in the Theravada school. The Savastivada school, which flourished in northern India, has also an Abhidhamma Pitaka, also of 7 treatises, but very different from the Pali Theravada Abhidhamma. So we could say that the Abhidhamma Pitaka would have probably grown out of a nucleus of teachings given from the very early period, maybe even during the Buddha's life, but as the monks discussed the teachings, elaborated upon them, and then over time, over the centuries, as the Buddhist schools became established in different geographical areas, the monks who were exploring and elaborating the teachings elaborated them in different ways so that we have different versions of the Abhidharma. Though in the suttas, at least the collections that we have, a great deal of similarity. It's in the Abhidharma that they differ significantly. And then the Visuddhimagga is a treatise on Buddhist doctrine and meditation, which is ascribed to a monk from India called Buddhaghosa, who came to Sri Lanka to study and to compile the Pali commentaries. And it seems that the Visuddhimagga is not an original work of Buddhaghosa using his own sort of creative talents, but rather what he did was to draw the material from the old commentaries preserved in Sri Lanka and put them together into this volume, which lays out a systematic version of the path of practice, with elaborate treatment of the practices for samadhi and for insight. And then in the middle chapters are a kind of formulation of the Abhidharma teachings according to the commentaries. And Buddhaghosa is ascribed to the 5th century of the Common Era. Okay, so that's a historical perspective on these texts. Can glimpses of the formlessness of dependent origination in dreams be valid? How can one tell? I have to confess that I've never had any glimpses of dependent origination in my dreams. But I would say don't trust one's dreams. If you want to have an understanding of dependent origination, first go to the suttas and see how the teaching is explained there. And then you can look at some explanation in the Visuddhimagga for some elaborations. But don't place a great deal of confidence in one's dreams. Okay, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. Okay, first question. Where is the karma stored over one lifetime? Is it stored somewhere? Yeah, so we use the expression that karma has been done and stored up, but in the early teaching, there's no particular place where karma is stored up, but once the karma is done, it's just, we say it has the potentiality of producing its results when it meets with the right conditions. But there's no particular place where it's stored up. So a later Buddhist school called the Yogacara school, in order to give some explanation of where karma is stored up, posited a particular type of consciousness which is considered the storehouse of karma. This is what they call the alaya vijnana, the storage consciousness. But in the early Buddhist teachings, and even the early Mahayana teachings, there's no concept of a place where karma is stored, but it's just that once karma is done, that potentiality remains somewhere, somehow. And when the karma meets with the conditions, it ripens. Okay, the second question here. Why is the heart base co-nascent for rebirth linking? So the heart base is co-nascent for rebirth linking, because the rebirth in, say, a human birth or an animal birth, the rebirth linking consciousness needs a physical base as its support. And so in the terminology of the Abhidhamma, that physical support is the heart base. It's called the heart base, even though in the case of a human birth, with that one-celled ovum, there's no heart there, but still there's a type of matter which is called the heart base. It's a type of matter that can support the consciousness. So at the very moment of rebirth, the consciousness arises, and then that matter of the fertilized ovum becomes the heart base along with the consciousness. They occur simultaneously. But as the process develops, the matter of the heart base lasts longer than the rebirth consciousness. And so the matter of the heart base will then support the next consciousness, which is a bhavanga, and the next another bhavanga. So in that case, the heart base becomes not a co-nascent condition, but a pre-nascent condition, because the heart base already exists, and now one bhavanga arises, then the next bhavanga arises, the next bhavanga arises, all supported by that pre-existing heart base. Okay, question 3. If someone is a non-returner, why would they be reborn in the form or formless realm? Yeah, when somebody is called a non-returner, it doesn't mean that they don't return to samsara, to birth and death. It means that they don't return to the sense sphere realm at all. But they still have more rebirths ahead of them until they attain arahatship. So somebody who becomes a non-returner has eliminated sensual desire and ill will. And those two mental qualities are the bonds that tie us to the sense desire realm. And so they cut off those fetters, and now they are, but they still have the craving for continued existence. And so for that reason, they'll be reborn, but not in the sensual realm, but in either the realm of form or the formless realm. When an arahat dies, where does the stream of consciousness go? Since energy doesn't disappear, it is transformed, neither created nor destroyed. So the stream of consciousness for the arahat comes to an end. You might say it becomes nirvanized, nibbanaized. Okay. If the rebirth linking, life continuum, and death are the same citta, please explain why. In terms of function, of course, the character, in terms of character, they are the opposite. Yeah, we don't say that rebirth linking, bhavanga, and the death consciousness are the same citta itself, because the citta is always changing, but they are the same type of citta. And the reason they are the same type is because these three types of cittas are all the result of the karma that has brought about the rebirth. So that karma first, sort of the first way in which it manifests its result is as the rebirth linking consciousness. And then, of course, you can't go on relinking again and again in a single life. So the rebirth linking consciousness just flashes into existence just for one moment. But that karma that brought the rebirth continues to exercise its potency by producing the bhavanga citta, the life continuum, throughout the course of the life, up to the very moment of death. So all of them are the results of the same karma that is generating the rebirth. So this is why they are the same type of citta. Question 2. These 3 cittas are, undercurrent cittas. Can they be fed by other types of consciousness as a nutriment? I don't think so. I'm not actually sure about this. But we say that, or the texts say that consciousness is the nutriment for nama-rupa. So consciousness usually is seen as nourishing in the sense of supporting or conditioning the body and the accompanying mental factors. But whether, say, when I'm in an active state of consciousness, can my active states of consciousness be the nutriment for the bhavanga? I don't think so, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, if these 3 are different, I can't really read. If these 3 are different, something life, what makes them different? Simply different or something else? I'm not sure that I understand the question. If the person wants to elaborate. You. Yeah. Take the wireless microphone.
You said the rebirth linking and life continuing and death is the same for each life, but it's different, different life. So what I want to ask is, what make them different? One life to
from
another,
one life to another life. Yeah.
When I say make it different, is I want to know whether it's just like, you see these movies, TV show, Extreme Makeover. They are the same, but slightly different.
What makes them different from life to life is the karma that is bringing into being the rebirth consciousness and the bhavanga. So now I have a life as a human being, so it's a particular karma that brought me into this life as a human being. So I had a rebirth linking, and I have a bhavanga, and I'll have the death consciousness, which are the results of the karma that brought me into this human existence. So it's that karma that is determining this particular type of rebirth consciousness and bhavanga. Now suppose my next life I'm heading for the animal realm. Okay, then there'll be some unwholesome karma comes up in the death process, and then brings the rebirth linking into the animal realm. So then I will have the rebirth linking of an animal consciousness. And remember, this will be the unwholesome resultant investigating consciousness accompanied by equanimity. So that will be my rebirth linking consciousness, which will continue through as the bhavanga through the rest of my life as the animal. Then suppose after the animal life, I'm to be reborn in the heavenly world. So another karma will come to the forefront and then govern the rebirth process, so I get reborn in the heavenly world with a rebirth linking and bhavanga of a deity in the heavenly world. Yeah, so it's the karma that governs the rebirth, that because the karma that determines each rebirth is different. And so for that reason, the rebirth linking and the bhavanga will be different from one life to the next. Okay, is there a difference in the ways karma ripens in a lifetime versus the ripening to affect a new lifetime, the placement at rebirth linking? Yeah, this is an important question. And you find the answer to that question, again, it's in the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma in the chapter or section on karma. So there are different ways in which karma ripens. So one of the ways in which karma ripens is by determining the rebirth. So that is the karma that governs the rebirth process. But then karma can ripen in the course of a lifetime by producing sometimes desirable results, sometimes undesirable results. And so those will be the karmas producing the desirable results and undesirable results. Yeah, so those are the differences in the way karma ripens. And we'll maybe see some of the details of this tomorrow when we look at dependent origination from the Abhidhamma perspective. I've enjoyed your references to the Rolling Stones. What is your favorite song of theirs? Is there a Rolling Stone song with an application to Buddhism? If you could meet either Mick Jagger or George Harrison for lunch, who would you choose? Why? I'll tell you something very interesting, actually. The manager for the Rolling Stones back in the 1980s was a Buddhist by the name of Samuel Cutler. Yes, the manager for the concert manager for the Rolling Stones was a Buddhist named Sam Cutler. I had met him in Oxford in England in the year, I think it was 1999. At that time, he was married to a woman named Sally. Well, her maiden name was Mellick, I think, Sally Mellick, but then her married name became Sally Cutler. And she was working on her PhD in Buddhist studies at Oxford University, and she was working part-time as like the office manager for the Pali Text Society. And they had a son, and do you know what they named their son? I think I heard it, but too many people are speaking at one time. No, no. I'm hearing it from someplace. Bodhi, right. So his name is Bodhi Cutler.
When is he going to ordain?
What is that?
When is he going to ordain?
I don't know. But I think they separated Sam Cutler and Sally. And I think she was Australian, but studying in England. I think she's living in Australia. I think he's still in England. I haven't had actual contact with them, but I met them in Oxford in 1999. And then he told me when I met him that he had been like the road manager, the manager for the road, they call it the road concerts for the Rolling Stones. What is my favorite song? You know, I don't really listen to the kind of music anymore. Just many years ago, I used to think that they were the greatest rock band in the world. Yeah. Okay, so, this one I had. Is there a time gap between the death consciousness and the rebirth linking consciousness? Is the death consciousness the proximity condition for the rebirth linking consciousness? Or is there a bardo state, an intermediate state between them? Can the karmic force still change during the bardo state? Actually, this was an issue that was debated between the different Buddhist schools. According to the Theravada Abhidharma system, there is no gap between the death consciousness and the rebirth linking consciousness. But at one moment, the death consciousness, the next moment, the rebirth linking consciousness. The other school, or some of the other schools, and continuing in Tibetan Buddhism, say that there is a gap between the death from one existence and the rebirth in another. And they have a very elaborate depiction of this intermediate state, the bardo state. So there is that difference. And what I've been able to gather from the accounts that I've read of people who undergo death and then have a recollection of their previous life and their death, there does seem to be a difference, a gap between one life and the next life. What happens, and this is reported again and again by people coming from different cultures, different backgrounds, who could have had no influence on each other, that the person is dying, say they're lying on their deathbed, and they undergo death, and sometimes they're not even aware that they've died, but they might find themselves, sort of their mind or consciousness, in a subtle body in the room, maybe up against the ceiling, looking down at their dead body lying on the deathbed. And sometimes they're trying to get back to the body, but they can't get back. And then in some of the cases I've read, they'll see maybe the relatives come into the room, then they'll get on the phone and give a call, then an authoritative-looking man with a satchel will come into the room, then take the pulse, check the breath, and then say something to the family members. Then they see the family members break out crying, and in some cases, this disembodied person, or subtle-bodied person, is trying to communicate with his relatives and say, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But the message doesn't get through. The relatives just go on crying and then preparing the body, and then they go to the funeral, the burial, or cremation, and the person is still around in a subtle body, watching their own funeral and cremation. Then after the funeral, for some time, they find themselves wandering around, moving around, no clear idea of the passage of time or spatial distances. It seems that they could cover hundreds of miles, even in a few seconds. And so they move around until they'll find a particular couple to whom they're attracted. And they'll hang around that couple until the lights go off. And then they find themselves sort of drawn into the womb of the woman, and then they lose that clear awareness of consciousness until they come out from the womb 9 or 10 months later, And then once they're able to speak, then they start reporting about their memories of their previous existence. So these cases seem to indicate a temporal gap. Yeah, use the microphone.
But Bante, don't you think that that's probably a sudden death, not like a preparatory death? Because
Not like a...
someone who prepares to die, because my mother-in-law passed away a couple months back.
Yeah,
And she had a massive stroke.
yeah,
And she clung to life for 3 days because nobody had known
Yeah.
that she had had a stroke.
yeah,
And when two sons arrived at the same time and took her to the hospital, they thought, like, for the I guess the strength of the stroke, they were shocked that she survived it. And she hung on to hand over her disabled son
Yeah.
to the other two brothers.
yeah,
And after that, she almost died that night,
yeah,
but they put her in like breathing tube and all that and kept her alive.
yeah,
But as soon as she realized, and once they took the breathing tube out, as soon as she realized she was paralyzed, like a whole side of
Yeah.
paralyzed, she just decided to go. She just got her hands
Yeah.
together. She couldn't open her eyes.
Yeah.
And she was like indicating, it's time for me to leave. So we were able to prepare her
Yeah.
in her journey because we
Yeah.
did chanting and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
priest
Yeah.
came and
Yeah.
all that, right? But I think in a sudden death,
Yeah.
you don't have that opportunity. So
Yeah.
sometimes maybe that consciousness leaves the body
yeah.
and is kind of lost. And
And
I
kind of,
kind of lost, or,
Yeah, yeah.
because these people, like the body has gone,
yeah,
and the consciousness doesn't have a
No,
place to go
no.
to or not prepared.
Yeah.
So in the Sri Lankan tradition,
Yeah.
we give dana and we
Yeah.
give merit.
Yeah.
Right? We
Yeah.
go to the temples and offer, and they have that,
Yeah.
30-day dana, the
Yeah,
3-month
yeah, yeah,
dana, the
yeah.
1-year dana.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're giving them merit to move on to the next
Yeah.
journey
Yeah.
in their life.
yeah. But even that practice of giving the dana and dedicating the merit to them is in a way presupposing that the person who has passed away, that their consciousness or being is still hovering around in some form so that they could receive the merit. My own teacher, Venerable Balangoda Nanda Maitreya, he was acquainted with these cases of rebirth memories where the person says that they've been sort of in this semi-disembodied state. And he says, that must have been a rebirth in the Preta realm. So he said that in order to preserve the idea of instantaneous rebirth. But in the suttas, the rebirth in the Preta realm is described as a miserable rebirth. Not as intense as hell, but the beings are supposed to be afflicted with constant hunger and thirst and misery. But from the reports of the people who have these memories, it's not neither painful nor pleasant, but it's just a kind of completely bland, flavorless, colorless state of existence, so that they're moving around until, and it seems to me to make sense that after a person passes away, if they're heading back I could see for a rebirth in heaven or in hell, an instantaneous rebirth will make sense. But if the person is going to come back to the human realm, if the rebirth is to be instantaneous, it would mean, okay, I have to say it, that there's a couple having sexual relations, the appropriate couple at exactly that moment that the person dies, to provide the suitable conditions. And the probability of that, in my view, would be very, very slight, to the point of being almost absolutely improbable. So it seems more reasonable is that the semi-embodied or the person moving about in this astral body is waiting for the appropriate conditions to appear, for the right couple to appear at the right time in order to take rebirth back into the human realm.
Thanks, Bante. And on the continuation of my grandma, there came to be actually sort of a huge conflict within the family, and some people were using I guess, the name of Buddhism to defend that she should maintain ventilation tubes in her and prolong her life because a miracle could happen. And she was 84, and we all were well aware that she didn't ever want to live a life like that. And so when the tube was put in, it had sort of repercussions and conflict. And then when the tube was removed, there was an accusation of sort of, you're killing her. And I wanted to seek clarification from you on whether or not, like, what kind of deed is that, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, because it's like a catch-22, because it's minimizing suffering, but it's also sort of like artificially holding on to life.
Yeah, in my opinion, and maybe my opinion will not be so orthodox, Theravadan opinion, if somebody their life is being maintained by artificial means, and one knows that the person would not have wanted their life to be sustained by artificial means, and there's no hope of recovery at all, if one stops the machine or removes the tubes, it's not a case of deliberately taking the human life. It's just not making that extraordinary, unnecessary effort to keep the life going on when the life is completely useless and futile. And it's different from euthanasia. It's not giving something to the person to make them die. It's just refusing to sustain the life by artificial means. But I didn't want to open a big debate about that topic here.
I'm a medical doctor and I have exactly the same problem. But in my case, the patient that was now intubated and really in a very bad shape wanted everything to be done and didn't want to be taken out of the life-saving machines. So in this situation, they asked me what to do, and I said, you have to follow the wishes of that person, and that keep them under the, the ventilator until they naturally die. So that's what I did.
Yeah, and that's a difficult situation, but okay, there's one more question here, getting back to Citta's, and then we'll have to end the discussion. All the Cittas are inputs to the being, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Humans also have output organs, the mouth to speak, feet to move, and so on. What Cittas account for these outputs, no matter how many sequences of the Cittas and Chaitasikas are put together, I could not explain these output actions. Let me just get some water. That's enough. Yeah, it's the mental factor of volition, which is responsible for motivating action through body and speech. Yeah, so most of these Cittas, particularly the unwholesome, the Cittas of the sense sphere, the unwholesome Cittas and the wholesome Cittas of the sense sphere are capable through their volition of motivating actions of body, walking, standing, playing, via Allison twisting and bending the body into inconceivable shapes, and speaking the way I'm speaking now. This is volition expressing itself through speech. So it's the volitional factor in the Cittas that manifests as output of body and speech. Okay, I think I've taken all of the questions, and no time for questions from the floor, but we could take more questions tomorrow. And so now we will move over to the meditation seats.